Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Farmers for Free Trade American Competitiveness Town Hall. We're going to wait just for a moment to allow everyone to access the town hall, and then we'll get started. Please stand by. It looks like we have a great turnout today, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Steve Noah, and I live in Clive, Iowa. It is my privilege to serve as president of the board of directors of Farmers for Free Trade and to be with you today to start this virtual town hall event. Throughout my career, I have worked on international trade issues and in international trade. In the early 1990s, I advocated for the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement in all three partner countries, a free trade agreement that has allowed Canada and Mexico to become our country's biggest export market for food and agricultural products. Today, we export over $40 billion in food and ag products to Mexico and Canada, up from approximately $11 billion prior to the passage of the NAFTA. It is fair to say that the North American Free Trade Agreement and now the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement have done more to support US food and ag producers in this country than almost any other action taken by the federal government in the past 50 years. We all know that we must continue to grow our export markets if we are going to grow the US food and agricultural industry. We are very pleased that Congress and the Biden administration managed to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, making critical investments in our locks and dams, ports, roads, bridges, and rural broadband. These investments will help America stay competitive in international markets. But America cannot compete if we are not in the game. If other countries enter into free trade agreements and the US stands on the sidelines, that means their producers can have a critical price and contact advantage over US products. In a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce John Bodie, president of the Corn Refiners Association. But before I do that, I have to briefly mention the outline for today's town hall and a few housekeeping items. First, we will hear from John Bodie. Then there will be a time for question and answers, which will be moderated by Brian Keel, Executive Director of Farmers for Free Trade. After hearing from John Bodie, we'll hear from Congressman Jim Costa of Colorado. We are recording today's session, and a link will be provided to the recording following the early this afternoon on the Farmers for Free Trade website. Near the top of the hour, we'll introduce Lori Boyer, past president of the National Association of Farm Broadcasters. Lori will introduce our panelists and facilitate a panel discussion on these topics. Following the panel discussion, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. So now, without further ado, allow me to introduce John Bodie, the president of the Corn Refiners Association. John?
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you. And special thanks to you, Brian Keel, Matt McIlvain, and Farmers for Free Trade for persistent, respectful, and bipartisan advocacy for American economic growth through free and fair trade. CRA is proud to be associated with Farmers for Free Trade. And of course, I'm very flattered to be in this webinar with Congressman Costa from California and the impressive panel that will follow. Today, to help facilitate this discussion, the corn refiners are releasing an internal analysis regarding the relative positions of leading trade economies. I requested this analysis some time back, so we might bring simple facts to bear on the question of whether moving slowly, if at all, on new trade agreements means the US is merely standing still or falling behind other leading trading nations. Special thanks for preparation of this analysis goes to my colleague, Michael Anderson, CRA's Vice President for Trade and Industry Affairs, and our Trade Super Intern, Gabe Cabanis. We want to emphasize that this is a pretty simple analysis and that we would welcome more in-depth analysis of the issue. The period of review is 2010 to 2020. That period was selected because it was substantial, recent, and spanned the administrations of both parties. While the analysis is simple, the comparisons are stark. Of course, the report may be viewed on our website, corn.org. I will summarize. As the leading trading nation in the world's largest economy, since the mid-20th century, the US has consistently pursued opportunities to expand trade, contributing to national economic prosperity and promoting economic development and peace abroad. With over 95% of world consumers residing outside US borders, trade liberalization and access to foreign markets through the pursuit of trade agreements remains vital to the economic fortunes of US workers, consumers, and industries. The Obama administration's signature trade achievement was negotiation of TPP, which political conditions never permitted the Obama administration to submit to Congress for ratification. President Trump alternately referred to himself as a free trader and tariff man. Despite trade policy taking center stage, prompt withdrawal from TPP was followed by very modest progress in trade agreements. I'm a big fan of USMCA, but to be fair, our report was very generous when it scored USMCA as a new trade agreement, since it was merely a modernization of NAFTA that offered very little in new market access. Now, the Biden administration's announced trade policy omits pursuit of new trade agreements. Potential for new trade agreements fell further with expiration of Trade Promotion Authority last June, a key tool for expedited consideration of new trade agreements in the Congress. Instead, the administration's trade policy agenda remains squarely focused on enforcing existing trade agreements, most notably USMCA and China Phase 1. That's very important, but it's not new trade agreements. New trade agreement negotiations with the United Kingdom and Kenya, initiated by the prior administration, have not been revived. Further reconsideration of the prior administration's withdrawal from TPP, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, has been rejected in favor of pursuit of a still undefined Indo-Pacific economic framework. So, over the last 10 years, US progress on new trade agreements has been very modest, and the outlook is not promising. Does that mean we're standing still? Or are we falling behind because the rest of the world is moving forward while we sit on the sidelines? The answer is clear. Rival trading nations have rapidly expanded trade opportunities through bilateral and multilateral trade arrangements. China is #1 in international trade. They've entered 10 new FTAs, including the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's largest trading agreement. The European Union is #2 in international trade. It has entered into 8 new free trade agreements, including agreements with Japan, Canada, and Mercosur, which includes Argentina and Brazil. Japan is #4 in international trade. It has entered 7 new free trade agreements, including with India, CPTPP, and the European Union. Canada is number 8, and it has entered into 8 new free trade agreements, including with the EU and CPTPP. By comparison, the US, which is number 3 in international trade, has concluded just 4 trade agreements, the most significant of which was the modernization of NAFTA. So China has 10, the European Union has 8, Japan 7, Canada 8 new agreements, and the US just 4, arguably 3.5. Of course, not all trade agreements are equal. A more elaborate analysis would quantify all of the reductions in tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. That was beyond our scope. But we note that our analysis has found the following benefits over the last decade from trade barrier reductions. The EU, $553 billion in benefits. China, $420 billion in benefits. And the US, $171 billion. So to put those numbers in perspective, the US benefit was about 30% of what the EU achieved and about 40% of what China achieved. That's not even competitive. So over the last decade, through bipartisan neglect of potential new trade agreements, the US has fallen behind in seizing economic development opportunities. Unfortunately, the outlook is worse. Major trade partners are moving forward with new trade agreements. In the past year, nearly half a dozen countries have expressed interest or formally notified their intent to join CPTPP, an agreement engineered by the US as the economic centerpiece of President Obama's pivot to Asia. The Asia Pacific region is the fastest growing region in the world, and China and other aspiring nations are eager to enter the circle of CPTPP membership as the US continues in an observer status. Additional multilateral trade pacts are emerging in the region exclusive of the US. I previously mentioned the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which creates the world's largest trade agreement, covering 30% of the global economy and 30% of the global population. Joining for the first time Asian trading giants China, Japan, and South Korea. I'll leave it to the panel to talk about how RCEP addresses things like worker protections, environmental protections, and the like. That agreement stipulates the removal of tariffs on 91% of goods and standardization of regulations on investment, intellectual property, and e-commerce, further deepening trade and supply chains in the region. I won't belabor the consequences of falling behind. In short, US loses markets and investment as our competitors set the rules of trade with our potential customers. For anyone who cares about the environment, worker rights, or even world peace, US economic influence is also substantially reduced. So we've fallen significantly behind. Our competitors are picking up momentum while we are slowing down, and this is a game in which it takes a long time to score. So to be an optimist, you have to have a very long outlook. Before I pause for questions, I do want to note a positive note. The good news is that there are many thoughtful leaders in Congress, Congressman Costa, certainly one of those, concerned about this situation. Also, the Biden administration is putting some very capable people into key positions. Ambassador Tai and Secretary Vilsack command great respect, and I'm very enthusiastic about the nomination of Elaine Trevino to serve as Chief Ag Negotiator. Good people may be able to make good things happen. So I'd be happy to address any questions.
Thank you, John. If you have questions for John, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Brian, do we have any questions for John at the moment?
We do. And John, thank you so much for that overview. And thank you for the corn refiners analysis and findings. Really, really great work, and excited to be able to post that to the farmersforfreetrade.com website. John, the question I have for you, the Biden administration recently has talked not about new trade agreements, but economic partnerships or economic alignments, specifically in Southeast Asia. Do you see that as an opportunity to open markets for ag products, or would you prefer to see us enter into the CPTPP or a new trade agreement?
I would certainly prefer that we enter into CPTPP or other new trade agreements. But I also am a big believer that successful advocacy is achieved by going through doors, especially open doors, rather than trying to break through walls. And so the Biden administration has charted a course. I think they should be encouraged to pursue it, and we should encourage those efforts to be as robust as possible. So let's celebrate what's going in a positive direction and encourage more of it.
Great. Thank you, John. And we do have a couple more questions, but I think since we now, I believe, have Congressman Costa on the line, I'm just going to mention these two questions. We'll put a pin in them and come back to them. One's a question, one's a comment. So John, you don't have to respond to these. The first question, which we can address during our panel discussion, any update on the WTO's proposal to reduce domestic support quotas? We'll turn to that later in the town hall. And then we had a comment, the lack of trade agreements is bad enough. Add on top of that Section 232 and 301 retaliation by India and China, and billions of consumers are increasingly being served by our competitors around the world. So I think a fairly aligned comment. And then we do have a question from Jackie Fatqua, ag reporter, mentioning that UK and Kenya deals are on hold. Why do you think the Biden administration has decided to not pursue those further where the Trump administration left them? And Jackie, again, I think we'll go to Congressman Costa and come back to that question. I'm sure a number of our panelists will be able to weigh in on that. So I'm going to put a pin in both of these questions until later in the program, but we will get back to them. And now, Steve, why don't I turn it back to you to introduce the Congressman?
Thank you, Brian. Before I introduce Congressman Costa, I would like to ask that if you have questions of the Congressman, particularly if you're with the media, would you please enter the questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen and identify which media outlet you are representing. It is now my great honor to introduce Congressman Jim Costa, representing the 16th District of Colorado, including all of the productive farmland in the Fresno area. Congressman Costa has been a true champion for our industry, both in his role as a member of the House Ag Committee and through his personal engagement with organizations such as Farmers for Free Trade. In 2019, Congressman Costa generously hosted the Farmers for Free Trade RV when we stopped in Fresno, and then participated in our rally on the National Mall after the RV had driven completely across the country. Whether it's in California or Washington, D.C., Jim Costa is always fighting for agriculture. Congressman, it's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me clearly, everybody? Thank you for those kind words. And I know we're in the middle of reapportionment throughout the country right now, but I believe you misspoke. I represent the 16th District of California, not Colorado. And I love Colorado. It's a wonderful state, but I don't think I'm moving there anytime soon. As many of you know, our agricultural, I think, breadth and width in California is something that I'm very proud to be an advocate of. The #1 agricultural state in the nation, and I'm a third-generation farmer, as I think some of you know. So with 44% of California's agriculture exported, these trade issues are critical. And so this issue of Farmers for Free Trade is something that I am passionate about and honored to have a chance to share a few thoughts with you. Let me begin by saying that the trade policy that our country has been undergoing for the last 2 decades has been challenging regardless of which administration's been in office. Having been a part of it over the last 2 decades. And I think it's critical that we try to develop some not only consensus, but continuity. And that's been, I think, part of the problem. If we look back in the last, 10 years, there were initiatives that were established that negotiated during the Bush administration and was continued under the Obama administration to pursue the trade promotional partnership, trade TPP with our 13 other countries in the Pacific. I thought that was a good strategy in dealing with the challenges of China, which are complex. China, let's be sure that you all understand where I'm coming from, is an adversary. But it's complicated because not only are they an adversary, but they're a competitor. And not only is it complicated because they're an adversary and they're a competitor in many different fields, but they're also a vast market for American produced goods. And obviously a source of products that American consumers like to consume. And so I thought, as opposed to engaging in a trade war, as the last administration tried to do, and separating ourselves from the TPP effort, I think what we're dealing with now is the product of decisions that were made at that time. I also felt that with the Europeans, who are our allies, not our adversaries, but who also are competitors, but yet again, a vast market. I mean, when I look at Europe and I think of the World Trade Organization and some of the other entities in which we engage in fact, that we actually created together, it reminds me that we must think of how we can reach consensus, because when you look at Europe and the United States combined and Canada, we account for over half the world's economy, Now, that's not going to continue as we move on to the 21st century. But as Western democracies that share common values, we still have the ability, I think, to write the rules. And we know that in many cases, our competitors or adversaries don't follow the rules. I'm talking about China, obviously, and India and other countries. And now we've got a situation in Europe with Brexit, where the UK wants to establish its own trade relationships separate and apart from the EU. And the Biden administration has been in office now for 10 months. It's been frustrating. We didn't get our trade ambassador confirmed, I think, until June of this year. And we still don't have the agricultural trade person, Elaine Trevino, who I've worked with over the years from California, confirmed. And she needs to be confirmed. We need to have that experience and expertise in place. So it's a challenge to say the least. And that's why I would term at this point the Biden administration's trade policy a work in progress. We're still trying to determine with the White House, with the State Department, with the U.S. Trade Ambassador, how they want to establish a programmatic effort on what they will continue as a part of the previous administration, and what new efforts that they want to establish as a part of this administration's foreign policy and trade policy. And that I don't think has been clearly defined yet, although there have been a host of initiatives with our European allies, as with our Asian markets. But we still have situations that complicate factors. The pandemic obviously makes it challenging, to say the least, in terms of how we work together, not just with our allies, but the global community. And that impinges upon efforts with the World Health Organization and other international organizations, including the United Nations, that either directly or indirectly impacting our trade issues. We also want to ensure that we establish a level playing field. And I'll just give you an example, and I'll close here so we can open it up for questions on how challenging this is for us. We learned a lot over 22 months ago with closure of restaurants and schools on how we take a complicated food supply chain in which 4% of the nation's population is directly involved, and you turn it upside down. And we saw the impacts on markets at the farm gate and every step along the line of the food chain. I learned, I never understood or knew before that, for example, over 70% of the bacon and pork bellies consumed in America are in restaurants. So how that changes things, of course. And we're dealing with the current bottleneck that we have in Long Beach and Los Angeles harbors. And so critical, with 40% of the container business coming into those ports for our own economy. But yet so many of those tankers, once they are offloaded, going back empty. And that's unfair. That's an unfair trade practice. And so we've got legislation that we hope would address the issues of demurrage and the unfair trade of those tankers going back, while we've got agricultural products and other American products that could be filled in those tankers as they return back to those Asian ports. So we're dealing with the complexity of all of this. And I'm very interested in listening to this group, this town hall, because having worked with you on a host of issues over the years on trade-related matters, your input and your insight is valuable as I try to work on a bipartisan basis on all of the above. So with that said, that kind of touches upon, I think, a number of the issues that we're concerned in dealing with. And I'd be happy to try to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you, Congressman. And my apologies, I do realize that Fresno was in California. Brian, do we have any questions for Congressman Costa at the moment?
We do, and I would encourage people to add questions to the Q&A function. I see some have sent us questions in the chat, but please do add questions to the Q&A function. Congressman Costa, California is obviously a major part of U.S. agriculture. From your perspective, thinking about California export markets, where would you like to see new trade agreements negotiated first and foremost?
Well, I think we should re-engage with the countries that we were a part of on TPP. And I've suggested that in committee hearings. That's been raised among a number of witnesses that testified. And I've raised that to the administration. I think that's an important opportunity. And I think we need to explore whether or not, under what circumstances we could re-engage there. I also think that given the recent impacts with our neighbors to the north and to the south, Mexico and Canada, that we look at the United States Mexico trade agreement, USMCA, that I supported, that really is a follow through of NAFTA 2, to ensure that it's being fairly implemented. We've got some problems right now with both Canada and Mexico regarding the efforts to employ electrical vehicles and their concerns about that not complying with the USMCA, their desire to retaliate with milk products. And of course, we've had problems in the past with Canada on their supply side management effort, and we tried to negotiate that through USMCA. And Mexico is a large market for American dairy products, especially California, and our white cheese. It's exceeded, I think, $1.4 billion and increasing. So we've got to figure out how we work through that with our neighbors to the north and to the south And then finally, we've got the steel and aluminum item at least worked out for the time being with Europe. But I always insist, and I've sent a number of letters and communications with the EU ambassador here at the United States, that American agriculture must be on the table. I mean, Europe is employing this farm to fork strategy. I don't know how well that's going to work. But clearly, as the chairman of the subcommittee on livestock and foreign agriculture and the chairman of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, I'm trying to get my colleagues with the European Union to engage on meaningful conversations about how we deal with agricultural trade between Europe and the United States.
Thank you, Congressman. And I was remiss at the start of the personally thanking you for your strong leadership on agriculture. And again, it was great to see you in Fresno on the motorcade for trade, and then to have you for the National Mall rally. So thank you for being such a tireless advocate. We have a question from Jackie Fatka. She asks, you mentioned still trying to determine the administration's trade policy. Has Ty and other USTR staffers held any conversations on Capitol Hill on their trade agenda? Any indication of whether they will even pursue TPA renewal? Jackie Fatka, policy editor with Farm Progress.
Well, let's be clear. I can't speak for the administration, and I don't intend to. I have had a couple of conversations with Ambassador Tai. She's very cognizant of certainly the concerns that I and others have related to American agriculture and what the emphasis is going to be here in the first 2 years of this administration. I think the efforts, I say a work in progress, because you have to, I think, consider that they, didn't have the ambassador confirmed until the summer, early this summer, and they have been, I think, trying to play catch up in terms of how they interact with both our trade competitors in Europe and in Asia, realizing that they intersect with other foreign policy objectives that the administration is trying to achieve. And we got to be mindful of the fact that, as I noted a moment ago, that when regards to the USMCA, historically, even with NAFTA, we saw our neighbors use phytosanitary standards, and we see that coming up again as a non-tariff barrier to leverage us. And I think that's always problematic, regardless of the administration in office. And we're having to deal with that again. And so we've asked the ambassador to testify before the House Ag Committee. And I've asked her personally to testify before my subcommittee. My sense is they're in a place where they want to do that here beginning of next year. And obviously, we need greater clarity as to what the priorities are in terms of this administration's policy and where agriculture fits in, and how they attempt to deal with it with both our allies and our adversaries.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and we do have one more question in the chat box or in the Q&A. Congressman, this one is from Garrett Downs from Inside US Trade. Garrett asks, Representative Costa, you just called China both an adversary and a very large market. With phase one purchase commitments running out in 3 weeks, what would you like to see the administration do to ensure China continues buying agricultural goods?
Well, I think the administration is putting pressure on the Chinese in multiple ways. This 3 week deadline that you noted is a problem. It's not going to sort itself out, in my view, in 3 weeks. China clearly, as I think we're contemplating, figuring out how they're going to link that with a host of other issues that they're dealing with. That seems to be the normal way in which these things are engaged in. And it's my desire to get some clear understanding as to under what circumstances the administration is going to proceed, given this 3-week deadline. But there are a host of other issues that we're dealing with on China, as well as India. And, you know, my virtual background, I'm in Washington, D.C. I know it doesn't look like it right now, but that's one of my almond orchards. And right now we see a decline in almond prices, as we do with a host of other commodities so that we grow in this country and certainly in California, in part because of the uncertainty of these markets. And we think that right now, almonds, but as well as a lot of other products that we produce are underpriced. But all the uncertainty that we're dealing with is a part of the challenge on how these prices are impacting farmers, including yours truly. And the bottleneck, of course, in Long Beach and Los Angeles is a part of the challenge we face. We've got to be together. Let me close on that note. You know, we're all aware where the challenges lie, and we want to maintain an access to all markets, including the large Chinese market. But we must, I think, demand a level playing field and fair trade. And that's one of the reasons why this legislation that Congressman Garamendi and I have written together that has strong bipartisan support. I'm hopeful that we'll get out of the Senate. I think we need more tools with the president, with the Federal Maritime Commission to deal with these issues that are hindering our ability to export our products. But there are other factors that we've got to establish in terms of fair trade. And this is going to be, I think, something we must work together on a bipartisan basis, especially over the next 6 months as things become much more established between this administration's policy, trade policy, how it affects American agriculture, and how it affects every other effort of our international engagement. And that's why I mentioned, I mean, the reality is that all these things are related, either directly or indirectly. And so we, as much as I might like to look at agricultural trade aside and in a vacuum, I think it's unrealistic to think in those terms because it's never been that way in the past with any administration, and it certainly isn't that way today.
Thank you, Congressman Costa, for your time today and for your continued support of U.S. agriculture and agricultural businesses.
I need to market these almonds behind me, so I need your help. And so if you all do me a favor, it's the holiday season, and notwithstanding the pandemic, we're trying to be together and safe with our families and friends. So a handful a day is all I really ask of these almonds, because they're very good for you and healthy. And, you know, we need to boost all markets of agriculture in this country. And we have, you know, with 4.5% of the nation's population directly involved in the production, processing, and the exporting of American agricultural products. It's an amazing success story, but it's one in which it's very competitive, and we have to work together.
Thank you. We'll see what we can do about the almonds.
In California.
California. We will now go to Colorado, however.
Right. Well, happy holidays to one and to all for you and your families. Merry Christmas, and may the new year bring us not only good tidings, but health. Remember, we need to be safe, and everybody, please get vaccinated. It's so critical.
Thank you, Congressman.
It is
Thank you.
now my pleasure to introduce Lori Boyer of Colorado, who will moderate our panel discussion and close out the town hall. Lori is a farm broadcaster from Northern Colorado and the past president of the National Association of Farm Broadcasters. Lori, thank you so much for taking time today to moderate our panel.
All right, well, thank you. I'll just point out that I am an almond connoisseur. I do eat my almonds. They are very healthy for you, and I do a lot of exercise, so they assist. So I think I'm doing my part there, Congressman. But thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me. And thank you to the Farmers for Free Trade for hosting this virtual town event. These types of events are so important for the agriculture community, and being past president NFB, we believe in these kinds of events. It's a chance for us to not only talk about the events, but get to know each other and discuss issues that are critical to agriculture, which means they are critical to our families, our businesses, and our communities. As Steve mentioned, just real quick, I'm a farm broadcaster here in Eastern Colorado, about an hour and a half east of Denver, in Fort Morgan, Colorado, on the way to Nebraska. I've been doing this for a number of years, going on 25 years as a matter of fact. And about a year ago, I started the Queen of Ag podcast. That's kind of my nickname around here. And that is how I actually met Brian and got connected to this group. So it's great to be with you today. And thank you to our panelists for joining us as well. Just want to note that we are recording this town hall event. We'll have a recording available to the public later today. After our panel discussion, we'll have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please note your organization affiliation. And if you are a reporter, please highlight that and they will try to get your questions at the start of our Q&A session. So on that, we will begin. We have a great lineup here today. First off, we have from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, John Began. He is a professor and the Michael Yanni Chair in International Trade and Finance in the Agricultural Economics Department and the Clayton Yider Institute of International Trade and Finance at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. John has ongoing research, teaching, and outreach programs on international agricultural trade, non-tariff measures, and global food security. Prior to joining UNL in 2019, he was a professor at North Carolina State University and Iowa State University. Began received his PhD from UC Berkeley in 1988. So it is my pleasure, Mr. Began, for you to begin our panelist discussions here today.
Thank you. Should I start now or okay? So thank you, Laurie, for introducing me so kindly and for inviting me to be on the panel. So I share all the concerns that have been expressed, and I'll try not to be repetitive from what John Bohr and Congressman Costa said. I think maybe from an academic point of view, I think it's important not to be just mercantilist thinking of market access, but I think we have been reminded recently that cheap imports are also useful. If you think of the fertilizer sector, also the chassis needed to move commodities that are coming in the US. Also, my other concern is really on macro policy. We haven't talked too much about that, but I could see how a tightening of the quantitative easing policy that we have been experiencing really in the last almost 20 years now could lead to reduce competitiveness through exchange rates changes. Just to a little bit re-emphasize what John Bohr said, but looking at a longer perspective, the EU agreements, EU has signed 57 agreements in total versus the US 14. So that's on the whole history of GATT WTO. And if you look at Europe, beyond the EU, you have about 154 agreements done in Europe versus about 50 for North America. And so it's just not the last 10 years, but overall, I think the EU, not so silently, but steadily has really integrated much more than what North America has been doing with the rest of the world. The EU has also integrated with Africa and with its standards, and I think that's also an element that Congressman Costa mentioned. And I think the US is losing ground on that front. Although Africa may not be a very important market right now, income per capita is still low, but growing. Population is still growing also in many African markets. And so those markets are going to become eventually important markets for US commodities and food goods. And so there we're losing ground, not only in terms of market access, but especially in terms of setting standards on biotech or phytosanitary regulations. So that's an important point. Also noting that Mexico and Canada have diversified their partners away from the US with the EU, the CPTPP, China, and so forth. We see avocados being shipped from Mexico to China. I may repeat again what has been said before. So, stepping out of the TPP was a major blunder in terms of economics and geopolitical terms. The mini deals with Japan, for instance, provide some market access for increased quotas and reduced tariffs, so that helps on the beef side, for instance. But it misses what we call in academia the deep integration. So the biotech issues, the phytosanitary issues, dispute settlement, which is also important. So all that was in TPP and is still in CPTPP, and so that's a major opportunities that we have lost, and that say the Japan-US agreement hasn't even put a dent in. The China Phase 1 agreement was a very good agreement in the sense that it was a deep integration agreement with chapters on SPS, TBTs, and so forth. That was very important, but of course it's expiring now. And then Phase 2, as mentioned, is not anywhere to be found. And then we still have retaliatory tariffs hanging around. So I just mentioned the chassis that are also needed and facing tariffs, retaliatory tariffs from the US. The EV problem was mentioned as well. So, those are good compromise gains in dairy export, as noted. I mean, all those are really, I would say, example of what John Boat called the bipartisan neglect that we're facing. Last, I think I want to mention the US ITC and Department of Commerce exacerbating the volatile situation on fertilizer with those anti-dumping and CVD duties that make expensive fertilizer even more expensive. And then compounded by the problems of the backlogs that makes availability of fertilizer also uncertain. So as noted by Congressman Costa, all those things are interrelated, and so I think we're in a big pickle right now, not even to mention immigration policies that make labor shortages more of a problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And again, we'll be taking questions after the panelists have spoken. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is where you'll put those questions. Next, we have Manuel Sanchez, who recently became the China director for the U.S. Grains Council based in Beijing. In this capacity, he identifies and works with the China office team to address trade, technical, and policy-related factors relevant to building and maintaining a market for U.S. grains and co-products in China. Before assuming his current role, Manuel was the regional director for the Southeast Asia U.S. Grains Council office and was based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I'm probably butchering that, and he can correct me. Thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning to you all connected virtually. It's a great pleasure to be here connecting via this modem. I am currently speaking to you from Orlando, Florida. I'm in the U.S. on my home leave, but as you heard from Lori, I'm transitioning from the role as regional director for Southeast Asia, based out of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for the U.S. Grains Council, where I cover 13 markets in Southeast Asia and Oceania, into my new role as a director for the U.S. Grains Council in China, for the People's Republic of China, based out of Beijing, China. I'm here to not necessarily talk about China, but I'm going to bring you some real life examples of some of the challenges that I was dealt with, that I faced while doing my work on the ground for the U.S. Grains Council. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the U.S. Grains Council, the U.S. Grains Council is a non-for-profit organization funded by private and public funding for the sole purpose of developing markets abroad for U.S. coarse grains and co-products, including U.S. corn, barley, sorghum, and their byproducts. And it's certainly been a great pleasure of mine to work for the U.S. Grains Council over the last 7 years in different capacities throughout my tenure. So as it relates to the topic that we're going to be talking about here, ultimately, trade and how important trade is, and not only for U.S. agriculture, but more importantly for U.S. coarse grains producers. In 2019, 2020, sales to FTA partners, countries that we have FTAs with, accounted for more than half, 53% to be exact, of all grains in all forms exported, according to the USDA data. So we heavily rely on trade partners, of which we have FTAs, and we're very fortunate for that. And certainly, we want to maintain those markets. But more importantly, I think what I'm here to talk about is those countries that we don't have an FTA with, and how not having an FTA has really hindered our ability to position our valuable commodities in front of these countries. I'm talking about countries like Vietnam, and the growth that we have seen in Vietnam over the last 2 decades, it's quite remarkable. In early 2000, Vietnam imported barely 1 million metric tons of corn. Now that's 40 million bushels of corn. If you look at their imports today, those imports have exploded to 12.5 million metric tons. So it's significant, the growth in a market like Vietnam. Another market is Indonesia, the 4th most populous country in the world. And in a market that we don't have access to on the corn side. We're struggling to position our corn into this market. There's also the Philippines. And now these aren't just individual markets that are currently buying and importing agricultural commodities. These markets collectively also form part of our top 10 markets for U.S. ag exports. So they're valuable markets for us. And without an FTA, we're going to be struggling to capture some of that market share. So I'll give you one of my own personal examples. I've been working in Vietnam for a little bit less than 5 years here. And in Vietnam, we've done great work. We've had an office in Vietnam since the mid-90s. We were one of the first cooperators on the ground there, really helping them as they began to open up to the world. But no matter what work we do in the market development and working with local partners, not having an FTA has really hindered our ability to compete. An example that comes to mind is Russia. Russia has an FTA with Vietnam, and whenever they ship corn, it puts us at a disadvantage. Corn, as you guys all know, is a valuable commodity, and just a 2 to 3% difference will put us at a disadvantage and favor a country like Russia that has an FTA with Vietnam. Now, we've done some work on the ground. Just in the last 30 days, we lobbied and worked really hard to bring down the import duties for U.S. corn in particular, which were at 5%. We brought them down to 2%. But even 2% isn't acceptable. We want to see import duties there at 0, so we could have a level playing field with other origins. And an FTA in a country like Vietnam will do wonders for U.S. ag, not only today, but also for the future, as we see the growth in this market continue. Another example is Indonesia. I mentioned earlier, Indonesia is the 4th most populous country in the world. You have a burgeoning middle class there with a desire to consume more protein in general. Because of a lack of an FTA, you're seeing other markets like Australia that have signed an FTA with Indonesia really come in and service that market. You're seeing exports out of Australia increase significantly while we struggle to position our coarse grains and co-products into this market. And then lastly, ASEAN in general, and this part of the world is close to 1 billion people, and it's only growing. Within ASEAN, you have Thailand, you have the Philippines, and you also have emerging markets like Laos and Cambodia. If we don't get our foot in there today, we're really going to struggle in the long term to tap into these markets. Exports matter, certainly matter for us at the U.S. Grains Council, but it also matters for stakeholders here on the ground in the U.S. In terms of value, the share of U.S. agriculture and food production sold internationally has remained steady at approximately 20%, despite the increase in production and efficiencies which we're seeing on the ground. The time is now to act. We need FTAs to access growth markets like Vietnam, like Indonesia, and like India. I don't know if there's any questions for me, but then that's really what I wanted to chime in is talk about my own experience there, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you. I had to get myself unmuted there. Sorry to leave you hanging. All right. And we'll be back again with Manuel a little bit later on. Now from the U.S. Meat Export Federation, we are pleased to be joined by Erin Bohr. She is an economist, and chairman of economics for the International Meat Secretariat, economist for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. She received her MS, her Master of Science in Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University. She received her Bachelor of Science in Agribusiness at California Polytechnic State University. As an economist, she is responsible for USMEF's red meat export forecast, trade policy related analysis, global market analysis for US exporters, and US market analysis for international customers. And I understand Erin was raised on a cow-calf operation right here in Colorado. Welcome, Erin.
All right, thanks so much, Lori. And thanks again for including the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Greetings from our global headquarters here in Denver, Colorado. And at USMEF, we work to enhance international demand for U.S. beef, pork, and lamb. And that's with the coordinated collaborative efforts between our various partners and stakeholders. And we're also, along with our industry partners, longtime collaborators with USDA and USTR, and especially for USMEF with the Foreign Ag Service, our longtime partnership through the market access and foreign market development programs. And I think I also echo a lot of what's already been said. So I'm going to give a little bit of perspective on meat exports specifically. The US is the largest beef exporter in the world on a value basis. Our exports will top $10 billion this year for the first time ever. And on the pork side, we're also the largest exporter on a single country basis, and our exports will top 8 billion for the first time ever. So new records. And we're now exporting about 15% of our beef production and more like 30% of our pork production, including those variety meats. And exports are critical because they add value to every animal that we produce. And they also help us to keep affordable beef and pork on the tables of our US consumers. We know that US consumers have a strong preference for the middle meats. So those steak items on the beef side and the middles on the pig side too. So things like ribs and bacon. And at the same time, we produce kind of an excess of things like bone-in hams and shoulder claws and gooseneck rounds. And we don't consume nearly as many feet or tongues or stomachs as our international customers do. And so exports are all about carcass optimization. And prices for feet and stomachs in China today are around $1.50 to $2.15 per pound. And those bone-in hams trade at about half of that. So beef tongues to Japan are over $11 per pound, and intestine over $3.60, and short plate over $5 a pound. So you're noticing a lot of these items we don't necessarily see in our local supermarkets, and exports, again, are critical to adding that value. And importantly, demand has increased in the States and around the world for US beef and pork through the pandemic. So consumers have recognized the nutrition, the health attributes, but also the taste and convenience and cooking these products at home when we've been eating out less. And so US exporters have also overcome serious logistical challenges. Congressman Costa recognized this as well. And so in a way, this makes our export success that much more impressive because it has been essentially a logistical nightmare, and that continues today. And this is among the biggest barriers to our exports at this moment. But as we look ahead, we must, as the US, continue to and maybe return to leading and endorsing and facilitating rules-based trade, and also looking ahead on establishing new market opportunities for US agriculture. The US beef and pork industries are benefiting quite significantly from the phase 1 agreement with China and from the Japan-US trade agreement. And just for example, on the beef side, our exports to China in 2019 were about $86 million. This year, they will be $1.6 billion. And so even if we have to look at trade in a bit more creative light, there are certainly opportunities for US agriculture. And at the same time, if we look at our exports to our trade agreement partners, so including Japan, but not including China, since we still have big tariff disadvantages in China, US red meat exports to our trade agreement partners will account for about 58% of our export volume and in this year, and 53% of value, or about $9.5 billion. So there are still markets where we are currently missing out. And some of the big ones include China. Again, if we talk about trade agreement and tariffs, as well as non-tariff barriers, Vietnam, the wider ASEAN region, which has been mentioned several times, Africa, the United Kingdom, and even Europe. China is the biggest importer in the world of both pork and beef, and US pork is still subject to those Section 232 retaliatory tariffs. So that's a 25% tariff disadvantage in the biggest pork importing market in the world. And on the beef side, although we have tariff waivers for Section 301 tariffs, we compete against countries that have free trade agreements with China. So they're at zero tariff for product from New Zealand, from Chile, and Australia is headed there. They're at 3.6% today. The Philippines is another market with quite high tariffs. And at the moment, trade has been benefiting so far this year from temporary reductions on duties on pork imports because they are trying to fulfill an African swine fever related pork shortage. But then there's great uncertainty as to whether they will extend those tariff reductions next year. And if they don't, then we expect a significant pullback in shipments to the big and potentially even bigger Philippines market. But again, without proactive trade engagement there, their imports in the future will actually be smaller. And so again, across the ASEAN region, you have Australia and New Zealand benefiting from free trade agreements, and then Canada looking to negotiate as well. So our big competitors. And as Manuel mentioned, Russia being a big supplier into Vietnam. They're one of the biggest pork suppliers into Vietnam today with their duty-free access. And we have to remember these new entrants like Russia, who was a major importer of beef and pork not that long ago. They're now a major net exporter of pork onto the world market. And again, looking to Africa, the Kenya FTA held promise to develop a foothold in that region, which will be increasingly important as we look to the future. And with the EU as our biggest competitor and big supplier of pork into our market, where we have minimal import duties on product coming into this country, it would be ideal to have better access into that European Union for US red meat. And again, this brings us to non-tariff barriers. So these remain a big hurdle for US exports. These can be addressed outside of free trade agreements. And these include obvious restrictions like Europe's longstanding ban on hormone growth promotants, but also their restrictions on things like pathogen reduction treatments, which we use for food safety, and growing concern about a new era of trade restrictions to be implemented through Europe's farm to fork and biodiversity strategies, and as a part of their Green Deal. So examples include restrictions on antimicrobial treatments, deforestation, package labeling, and so on. This space is very complex, and there's a risk that the EU will implement excessive regulations throughout the supply chain, so literally farm to fork, while also potentially stifling innovation and certainly increasing costs. So again, we need to think creatively about the future opportunities and new frameworks for trade agreements, and also engage on these potential whole new chapter of non-tariff barriers coming at us. And thinking to the future, we must also not forget about regions like the ASEAN and Africa, as well as Latin America, and build relations with these more developing parts of the world. We have agreements with the Western Hemisphere, fortunately, and we must stay engaged there. There's also further potential for regions like the Caribbean and in some countries in South America where we do not have free trade agreements. Again, as we look to the future, there will be new challenges and opportunities and expectations of a rapidly growing middle class in Asia and population growth in Africa. And in the US, we have unique comparative advantages due to our natural resources, our research and innovation, so universities, USDA, and private companies and investment there. And our strong domestic market is really our rock solid foundation. So we must continue to innovate to meet the world's demand for high quality red meat, while also enhancing our sustainability. And trade is a key part of feeding the world sustainably. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move along here today with our last panelist. Finally, we are joined by Robert Chesler, the recently appointed Chief Executive Officer for United Dairymen of Arizona. In his role, Chesler is responsible for establishing a clear vision to drive organizational growth through strategic thinking and partnership with the board and other members of the UDA leadership team. Robert joined UDA with 20 years of senior leadership experience spanning multiple sectors, including the dairy industry, and he brings a deep understanding of global and U.S. dairy markets to our discussion today. Thank you for joining us, Robert. Robert, I am not sure that we are all hearing you here today.
Oh, how
there
about
we
now?
go. We got you now.
If we can solve the technology problems, we can solve anything in the world. I just want to say thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here alongside all of these incredible people. And I'm learning a lot listening to everyone and happy to share some insights from the dairy industry as well. This is an incredible environment, and I really am honored to virtually be here with everybody. The dairy industry, just like the others who have spoken, helps feed the world. One of the things that has not really been accentuated is the risk that is taken in the efforts to feed the world. Farming of any sort is some of the riskiest activities that can be undertaken. The expression "don't bet the farm" that we all use so casually doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the immense risk that these farmers, whether it be beef or it be dairy or it be grain, take upon their shoulders every single day as a burden. I've long held, since my days in political science and university, that every government around the world has two unwritten commitments to its people. One is to provide an economy that affords employment opportunities, and the second is to provide reasonably priced food. Without at least one of those, or in place, or an absence of both, you have a very unhappy society. And keeping people fed is the cornerstone to doing that. The U.S. is kind of the grain basket, bread basket to the world. And we need help. We simply need help here to manage that risk and find markets. There's a tremendous amount of talk about exports, and we are all dependent upon exports. We are all seizing the opportunity of exports. However, not all exports are created equal. And we need to identify which are the markets we are in, which do we need to find our way into, and what are the reasons for all of that. For example, our close geographic partners in Mexico, who we adore, our competitors from farther overseas are knocking on those doors and making strides and efforts to enter into that market. We need to identify how do we strengthen our relationship with them for the long term. How do we also identify markets that are buying maybe less commoditized products and investing in the future, investing in more value add products where we can enhance the margin back to our farmers so they can create efficiency on farm and therefore add value to the synergistic ecosystem of feeding the world in a less risky way and in a more attractive business sense. To do those things, we frankly are dependent upon the government. We are dependent upon trade agreements, free trade agreements, and other things that need to be negotiated. So just a few stats here to exemplify the situation we're in, and others have touched on similar things here. Between 2017 and 20, the U.S. has entered 9 trade agreements, and we are clearly falling behind competition with a disadvantage into key marketing regions, in particular the Asian region. And to understand this, the U.S. produces 6 times the volume of milk as New Zealand does, yet we have the same number of trade agreements. The U.S. produces nearly 13 times the volume of milk as Australia, and yet they have 12 trade agreements. The U.S. is about 2/3 the size of the EU, and yet they have 20 trade agreements. So the data belies the fact that we need more help. If we are going to maintain our place in the market, in the world, seen as a premium product, we have to be there and we have to understand our customers so that we can be there not only for today, but we can invest in a partnership relationship to be there for tomorrow. Internationally, some other stats that coincide with the numbers I just ran through, there have been 39 trade agreements signed between 2016 and 2021. Australia alone, as I noted, signed 12, New Zealand 9, and one currently in the works with the UK, and Europe at large 20. If we're going to be there, then we need help to be there because we have geographic barriers to overcome, and we have people to take care of, not only here, but around the world. Just over 700 million people in the world subsist on under $2 a day. We simply need to invest in efficiency to satisfy both needs, the upstream value add premium customer that seeks the higher level of protein that Manuel noted just a short while ago. We need to do that as cost efficient as possible because a penny does make a difference on whether or not they can buy our products and they can live healthier lives to the lower end people. So if we can service both, if we can have the free trade agreements to get us into the premium markets, it gives us money to invest into efficiency that help feed the masses all at the same time. And to do that, again, free trade agreements are the foundation upon which this world exists today to be part of this growing market for free trade. And without it, I don't know where we would take the increased production of U.S. dairy products, given the fact that the vast majority of it today is taken offshores. I'd love to field any questions.
All right, on that, we will get going with our discussion. Our goal today is to take a look at trade agreements that other countries have entered into and what those agreements mean for the U.S. in terms of both short and long-term access to international markets. With this panel lineup, we should be able to get a good read on these issues. So we start today with Mr. John Began, who will provide an overview of international food and ag trade agreements with other countries that we have been pursuing and what this has meant for the U.S. So John, we'll start with you once again.
And Lori, do you want to go to the question for John down at the bottom?
Oh, I sure can. Yes, thank you for pointing that out.
Absolutely.
John, yes, this question coming from Larry Lee. He's had two farmers comment to him that they are concerned USTR Thai might be more concerned with labor issues than trade deals. Yes, there are labor aspects of trade deals, but is this the focus in the right place?
Well, those are domestic policy considerations, and so I guess I'm not a politician. I'm not affiliated with any party. I want to give that as a caveat first. But I think I hear some echo. Maybe is that okay? I think the labor issues are part of the political calculus that politicians have to make domestically, and they have to pay their master, so to speak. Typically, those free trade agreements also have labor chapters where labor rights are negotiated and guaranteed to ensure that we have fair trade. But I think as we have all bemoaned this morning, the overemphasis on I would say energy policies in the U.S., labor issues have taken precedence over trade, and definitely my opinion is that I deplore this. So.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple other questions here that have popped up, so I'll just go ahead and move along with those at this time.
And Lori, I was going to say, why don't we ask folks about which countries are the priority, and then as people enter questions in the Q&A, I'll screen them and hand them off to you to ask.
Okay. So, which questions are the priority then?
So, which countries for exports should be the priority? It'd be great to hear that from each of the panelists in terms of if you could put your chips on one new FTA, where would you like to see it go?
Should I start? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's a no-brainer as everybody. I think there is a broad consensus that CPTPP and then the phase 1 or phase 2 China agreement are the two, I would say, immediate priorities.
Okay. Who else would like to answer that?
Manuel Sanchez here, and certainly, you heard me talking about ASEAN and that region of the world, but even if a regional trade agreement would be difficult today, then we could focus on bilaterals, right? But the thing for me is it's doing something today. We need to start, because the more we delay, the worse it puts us. So countries within the region, a partner like the Philippines. We should have had a bilateral with the Philippines, before CPTPP. Vietnam, Indonesia. So these are countries that, for me, are obvious countries. They're countries that should have been prioritized in the event that we weren't unable to do the CPTPP.
Okay, anyone else want to answer that, or should we move along? All right, Brian, do we have some other questions
Sure.
ready to go?
Sure. And so Chris Clayton had asked, Chris Clayton with DTN had asked a similar question, wanting to know where we should see the Biden administration negotiate a trade deal right now. He also asked whether Congress needs to renew TPA first. I wonder if any of the panelists would like to weigh in on TPA and again, your priorities for where you'd like trade agreements negotiated.
Let me give a chance to the other panelists.
And
I think, Chris, Chris's question kind of suggests that there's like one dot on the map, and I don't know that there's one dot that is the place we want to be. I think that there's a whole series of places that we need to move on concurrently at the same time. And certainly we'd love to see TPA renewed and to be active in that. I don't think we have to do one and then the other. I believe we have the resources to enter into multiple at the same time.
Anyone else want to take that question too? All right, we could probably move on to the next question then, Brian.
Sure. So Lori, the next question is from Jackie Fatka at Farm Progress. And I think this question is going to go specifically to Robert. She asks, what have you heard about those retaliatory actions against milk and dairy products as it relates to the electrical vehicle requirements in the infrastructure plan? And I know there's been talk about milk and dairy retaliation. There may be retaliation from other countries, so anyone can jump in, but maybe start with Robert.
Look, the ag sector is something that each one of us is dependent upon for food, for basic existence, which without, we can't really begin to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So without that, we can't begin to express our interest in electric vehicles or following Elon Musk to Mars. Now, with a bit of jest to that, the retaliatory actions are being taken quite serious, and we're waiting for further updates. I don't know that there has been anything significant in the very interim period here since the actions that you're noting in your question, but it's something that we're taking quite serious, and we're seeing a lot of threats to milk production in different spots as a result of it. And this is just one of many battles that we're fighting at present.
Anyone else like to add into that question? All right, Brian, I think we have another one queued up here.
Let's just see. I think we do. We've got a question from Garrett Downs with Inside U.S. Trade. Oh no, he was asking that of Congressman Costa. Sorry, let me jump over to the right screen. We have a question. Does current trade policy environment warrant a reconsideration of negotiating, quote, comprehensive trade agreements versus agreements that are somewhat more transactional in nature? For example, agriculture-specific agreements such as what occurred with Japan. I think that's a great question that any of the panelists can weigh in on. It's, should we be doing comprehensive trade agreements versus sort of sectoral trade agreements? Maybe some of you could also weigh in on WTO requirements about doing comprehensive trade agreements versus sectoral specific. John, would you like to start with that, and then anyone else can jump in?
Yeah, I have my bias, so I think given the supply chains, the complexity of modern supply chains, we should focus on so-called behind the border or beyond the border policy issues, and so SPS, biotech, any kind of trade facilitation measure that allows the flow of imports and exports, because our supply chains very often are involved in both ways, and so the I would say emphasis on market access is in a sense, I think, good in the short term. In a mercantilist sense, it's good to sell more, but the world has become more complex, And I think food processors and manufacturers need those supply chains to be, in a sense, working with lower transaction costs or trade costs, and goods have to move in both directions, both on the demand side or the import side and the export side. So I would say comprehensive agreements are the way to go.
Anyone else?
Absolutely. I'll echo John there. From my experience, we talk about tariffs as the main barrier, and it certainly is. But there's a lot to be said about non-tariff trade barriers. And I see this constantly. SPS issues on the phytosanitary side or fumigation. These are used on a daily basis to keep our commodities out of some of these markets. And I know that some of the other peers here, they suffer from some of these issues as well. So having a comprehensive trade agreement will allow us to at least have a pathway and define the rules ahead of time, so we could sort of mitigate some of these issues when they come up. In a country like Thailand, we had it recently with dry distillers grains, which the market was shut. In Vietnam as well. So these non-tariff barriers are also realistic barriers to keep our commodities out.
All right. I think
Yeah,
there's
completely agree.
go ahead.
Completely agree to echo the non-tariff barriers are often some of, if not the biggest hurdles, and they're constantly evolving. So as Robert said, we want to talk about uncertainty as our producers make long-term decisions. We need some certainty in these markets. So the kind of shifting market access is generally more on the non-tariff barriers, and especially when we have big players like China. So again, the need for the United States to be proactive in rules-based trade. And yes, I think we have to think creatively about how we successfully engage, given that what we used to know of, it seems like free trade agreements, it's a long process, and yes, it's ideal, but in the real world, if you will, to be proactive and think creatively, but also I think it's upon us to make sure that agriculture stays front and center, because we know our ag issues are some of the most difficult. So if we are talking about new, more transactional type agreements, to make sure that agriculture is a part of that, because typically, again, our issues are often the most difficult, as we know historically in these FTA discussions.
Okay. All right, Brian, should we move on to the lightning round, or is there any other?
We did have one last question from Jackie, but I think, well, let's do this real quick and then we'll do the lightning round, just so that we get Jackie's last question. Jackie asked, following up on UK and Kenya comments earlier, should ASEAN countries be higher prioritized market to focus on than where the Trump administration left off with UK and Kenya? I know a number of people have talked about the importance of ASEAN. Any thoughts in terms of relative importance, ASEAN versus UK and Kenya?
I'm going to echo some of Robert's comment. I think in general, I see a tendency that we like to put one versus the other. I think we need to be more inclusive. Really, the world is more dynamic. We need to make something happen. They're both very important markets. ASEAN is a crucial market. I have real life, examples that I've mentioned earlier. But the UK or Kenya or some of these African nations are also important markets for us. We should be able to make progress on both fronts. It doesn't need to be a zero-sum game as it relates to trade policy, in my opinion.
All right. Well, thank you all for the questions. Thank you for the great answers. We'll go ahead and move along here today and go into our lightning round before we conclude our town hall. To each of our panelists, assume that you are invited to the White House Christmas party, where you encounter President Joe Biden and Ambassador Catherine Tai. You have the time to say one or two quick comments to them about export markets. What do you say? We'll start with Manuel.
Export matters. Free trade agreements matter. If it's the Christmas party, I would imagine it's before December 31st. Phase 1 concludes effectively December 31st. So I would directly ask Ambassador Tai, where are we with phase 1? Is it going to get renewed? Our farmers depend on phase 1 just at least on the corn side, China has been such an important market for us that if that goes away, it will have impacts on the board, and our farmers will feel it on their farm and their daily operation.
Thank you. Erin?
Yes, I mean, continue the phase one. From where we sit, it does continue. The only thing, quote unquote, expiring is those purchase commitments. So keep all the SPS related details that were negotiated. We've benefited tremendously. And again, don't forget about agriculture as you look to the Asia region with a maybe potentially creative new framework. And just for example, we've talked about the ASEAN region a lot. So on the wealthy households, they're expected to increase from 10 million in 2020 to 47 million in 2031. So again, those are households with more than $25,000 income. And so these growing parts of the world, we need to be more active. And agriculture exports bring income and jobs. So using USDA ERS multiplier for red meat specifically, we'll have 18 billion worth of exports. This year, that's 32.75 billion in added economic activity, using their multipliers for a total of $51 billion and about 190,000 jobs just on those exports. So please keep agricultural exports front and center.
And Robert?
It's a good question. I suppose I would say, President Biden, arguably, food is your most powerful export tool. And while we respect the need to use it politically and strategically, at the same time, concurrently, we request that you use it to understand that we're a business and we need to get into the markets that are growing, the markets that will bring the greatest premium return so we can create efficiency back into a system. And if we don't, and we let the farmers down, then simply put, well, for a very, very short term, you will return lower prices to the consumer. You will hurt the American farmer. You will put them out of business, and you will ultimately cause higher prices, inflationary pain to the consumers of the U.S. and the world all at the same time. We are the essential. We are the thing that is needed, and we need your support arguably more than ever right now, domestically, but also abroad, because we have the arable land, and we have to put it to strategic use. We have to fend off the attacks that we have domestically from those food alternatives that seem to say that people don't want dairy or meat or other products, but yet use our names as buzzwords and marketing tools, which shows that the consumer has an affinity for them. And at the same time, we're under threat overseas from other governments that are being more proactive in free trade agreements that secure their futures in an advantageous way. And we need you to fight for us today.
Okay. And John?
Well, I want to step back and I would ask them, are you thinking of all the domestic policies you're implementing that is affecting negatively the farm sector in terms of its competitiveness, namely immigration policy, exacerbating labor issues, energy policy that feeds back into fertilizer prices and other places and the cost impacting the cost of farming. And of course, the macro policy that potentially could also impact exchange rates and the competitiveness of our exports.
All right, thank you. Very, very insightful. Appreciate everyone answering the lightning round question. Thanks to each of you for participating today in this Farmers for Free Trade Town Hall event. I'd also like to thank your organizations, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, U.S. Grains Council, the U.S. Meat Export Federation, and the United Dairymen of Arizona. Also, thank you to our congressman for participating and providing opening remarks. We had a really great discussion and really helped to shine the light on this important issue for U.S. food and agriculture. It is more clear than ever that the U.S. needs to be proactive in our efforts to open new markets. And they say in our industry, you are either at the table or you are on the menu. We'll have a recording of today's town hall event available this afternoon. A link will be posted on the Farmers for Free Trade website, which is farmersforfreetrade.com. On behalf of the Farmers for Free Trade, thank you for your time today, and thank you for tuning in to all, and thank you to our audience for tuning in and all the great questions you provided as well.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you to everyone. We very much appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again in the new year on our next virtual town hall.
Bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.
The same for me.